Hey, what's up guys, welcome back to Devlog Prod and welcome back to this indie game dev journey. This is the third episode, and in case you missed the first two parts, I left a link in the description in case you want to follow and see from the beginning. In the last video I created the aiming system and the abilities and weapon selection. And I did it so I could start on implementing some of the fundamental mechanics of the game. For example, one of those new mechanics is with the sword, and what I mean is that in the game there's a few parts along the way where the player will encounter enemies that are shooting some special orbs, and it's easier to kill the enemies if we redirect those orbs of energy against them. And he needs to use this mechanic because it will inflict more damage or because he won't have ammunition, for example. And this mechanic of redirecting projectiles will have another use as well. For example, it can be used to complete certain puzzles along the way. It can also be used to unlock a path and a few more things actually. So it's going to be really useful. I have already planned a few things in the story where this is going to be necessary. So I started by creating a few sword animations, like if it was charging a super strong swing, you know. It's basically an animation divided into three parts. The first one is for raising the blade. The second one is for holding the swing. The second part is going to loop, like if it was accumulating energy, basically. Not forever, obviously. And the third part is when he releases the swing. And of course the animations are just placeholders for now, nothing too serious, I just want to test things out. Basically the charged swing will be activated while the player holds the right mouse button. I still have to figure out if it will keep on consuming energy forever if the player keeps on holding the charged swing. Otherwise the player can hold it forever and only release it whenever it's convenient, and I think there must be a downside when using this mechanic. And at this point I also created functions for the camera to zoom in and out, functions for the slow motion, they are going to be necessary a few times probably, as well as for shaking the camera. And to test this out I needed a way for the rabbit to detect when there is a redirectable projectile in a certain range. So I added this circle collider that will trigger once he detects that there's an enemy projectile that can be redirected. I also created this arrow in Photoshop and created a particle system for it, and it will show what's the next direction of the projectile, basically, to where it's aiming. Then I basically reused this projectile that is being spawned every 2 seconds so I can test this out. And this is how it turned out. I pressed the right click mouse button and I charged the swing, I can move backwards, and when I think the projectile is in range, I release the swing and I redirect it to an enemy or to complete a puzzle or something like that. And I think it turned out pretty cool actually. You can do so many cool things with this mechanic that I'm really eager to start working with that. And of course there's a few adjustments needed, but for now it's running well, and I decided to move on to the next thing, which has nothing to do with this. But believe it or not, it's something that I want to get right from the beginning, and I want to understand how it's made. And it's creating cutscenes and transactions. It was something that was tinkling in my mind for a while, and I had to test it and I had to see how it works. So after doing some research I found out that using the timeline is the way to go. And surprisingly, it was actually one of those Unity tools that is super easy to use and works really well actually so far. So to test this out I first installed the package, obviously. Then all I needed was to create an empty game object, open the timeline, select the empty and create a new timeline. So this is going to be the director basically. This now will enable me to drag and drop anything that I want to animate on my scene with the timeline. For example, I have already dragged the rabbit here, which let's say it will enter in the scene from left to right. So I animated the transform from left to right and activated this running animation cycle until it stops, and then I activate the idle animation, for example. I also added a nice zoom out and these black bars at the top and at the bottom to basically tell the player that the cutscene is ending. And it adds a nice touch. It was just for testing. And this also was useful because it showed me that I needed to turn off the input of the player, of course, so it doesn't interact with the character movement. The timeline will play as soon as the game starts. You have this nice intro. Basically, I can do a bunch of things with this, and I have already started working on the intro of the game with this actually. But basically, it can activate with a script if I want to, and it's working really nice actually. Because it was something that I never did before, and I wanted to make sure I knew what I needed for that to work, and it was actually fairly easy, at least for now. Okay, so one of the last things that I want to show you is the first enemy. Not necessarily the first one that appears in the game, but like all the enemies, it requires a navigation system. Basically, some enemies need to get closer to the player so they can attack them, which are the close combat ones, and other enemies will shoot projectiles, but they still all need to know where the player is. So after researching about pathfinding, I found this to be the best option for this matter, and it's very well explained in a great tutorial by Brakis. To put it simply, it uses this library, the AI Pathfinding project, which lets me add a Pathfinder script to an empty, where I can say that everything that is inside the obstacle layer will be an obstacle for the enemy, for example. And those obstacles need a polygon collider as well. And once I press scan, it generates this nice grid where it shows these blue squares where the enemy can move. And the red dots are basically the obstacles. I don't have that many of obstacles in this scene, but it gets the idea. Now for the enemy to follow the player, I created a custom AI script that uses the same library to detect where the player is, and it keeps on updating the path to find the rabbit basically. Once it has the target, it starts moving. But since I want this to only detect the player within a certain radius, I used a circle trigger, and once the player is in range, it will follow him, and then once it's touching him, it will attack him. So I rigged the bee, created the bones and the weight, made a few animations, one for the idle and one for attacking actually. I didn't lose time creating an animation for flying, because the idle one was actually working well. And once the character was in detection radius, the bee will engage him and try to get close to sting him. And we can still outrun him very closely, but it's still possible. Of course, those are values that will be adjusted when the game is more completed. Now, this also led me to create all the attributes for the characters, basically the HP, the mana, if they have any HP or mana regeneration, and all of these stats that characters need. And once I connected everything and made sure my bullets were taking hit points of the bee, and his stings were decreasing my HP, I got this result. And I also made sure that the bee had a die animation, and if it's an enemy flying, it will turn on gravity and fall, which is pretty cool. And I also made sure that the scripts were already adapted for the grounded close combat enemies and for the enemies that shoot projectiles, the ones that are on the ground and the ones that are flying. So everything is pretty much ready for the next step, but that's something for the next video. So that's it guys for this episode. I hope you have enjoyed. In case you want to support me, there's a Patreon link in my description and I will appreciate very much. Lastly, I want to say thank you to every patron that supports me. It means a lot, and especially the super mega patrons, which are CJ, Goblin Plague, Igor Kapkin, James Finlay, Ruan Mendiola, Mark Brittingham, Nicholas Jave, Remio, Warden Studios, Javier Nguyen, and Ione. And without your support, these videos will be a lot harder to make. Thank you guys. And thanks everyone for watching these videos, and I hope to see you in the next one.